Welcome back to Proposing Your Research Part 2. Sorry for the abrupt end to the previous video, but the phone rang. Anyway, I've got them on silent now, so we should be fine. So when I left you last time, we were talking about the different sections of the research proposal, and we had just reached the important section of the research plan. So the research plan communicates to the reader the methods and techniques that you are planning on employing to answer a set of research questions. So what you need to do is just start with a one-paragraph description of the overall study design. Normally, research proposal templates are fairly limited in relation to the amount of space that they have for you to write. And so you don't need to give the reader chapter and verse on the historical background of a particular research design. You just need to provide them with a succinct description of the overall study design that demonstrates you know what you're talking about. You need to specify whether your study is qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods. Be very clear about this, and if you are planning on using a mixed method study, is your mixed method study a sequential mixed methods, a concurrent mixed methods? Is it predominantly quantitative or predominantly qualitative? You need to make sure that you're very clear to the reader about what your intent is in relation to this part of the research design. You also need to include the parameters or the scope of your proposed study. So think about that for a moment. What area are you going to investigate? Are you looking at a particular geographical scope? Do you need to consider the inclusion and exclusion criteria for your participants? There's a bit of flexibility in relation to how one might describe the scope of the study, but you need to provide the reader with an easily digestible segment of text that really explains what it is that you're trying to target or who you're trying to target. So in the research plan, the first of the subheadings is the sample. Now, it's really important that you describe how it is that you have deducted the size of your sample. That's a common error when I read research proposals for either grants or for the ethics committee. So you need to really undertake a power analysis of the population to deduct what your sample size is required to be if you are undertaking a quantitative study. Now, I've included a link on the PowerPoint that you can see there to a YouTube video, and that's by Associate Professor Ronnie Gunnison in the School of Medicine, Dentistry and Pharmacy at James Cook University. And Ronnie provides a really great explanation there about calculating a sample size using a particular piece of software. So go there, have a look at that. There are also lots of other YouTube videos and other helpful information on the internet that will be able to provide you with some resources to calculate a power analysis. In qualitative studies, however, it's a lot different, and sometimes it's quite difficult to predict the final sample size and constitution of that sample until you get into the study, and that is mainly because of the iterative and inductive nature of qualitative research. So that can be a little hard, but you do need to justify either putting down an approximate sample size or not putting down a sample size, but providing a reason why you haven't actually done that. An example of that would be a grounded theory study, where by the very nature of grounded theory and theoretical sampling, you don't know how large your sample is going to be. However, if you can justify that using the theory of grounded theory, so to speak, so actual text about grounded theory and grounded theory research designs, then you should be okay. Now, in your research plan, you may elect to include an estimation of one or more of the following to communicate the scope of your qualitative data and justify a smaller sample. So in some ways, this leads on from that earlier comment that I made about justifying either not nominating a sample size or justifying a small sample. Some of the reasons that you can provide there are, in fact, the amount of data that a small sample size can actually generate in a qualitative study. And that might be around pages of transcribed text. It could be about hours of interview time. It could be about your expected amount of self-report data that you're hoping to be able to collect. It could even be the number of digital stories that you're expecting to work with participants to create. So it just depends on what your methods are going to be as to what the scope of your final data set is going to look like. However, you can use that in your argument in and around a smaller sample size to the reader. The next subheading that you'd need to consider are ethical issues. Again, it is incredibly important to justify to the reader, first of all, that you have identified potential risks to participants and also to yourself as the researcher. And you also need to really explain how it is that you will ensure informed and voluntary participation in your study. It's not enough to just put down your sample size and move straight through then to methods of data collection, generation and analysis. We need to know more about ethical considerations for the study. Again, in a research proposal, you don't actually have a huge amount of space, so it might only be a very short paragraph, but you still need to identify that you've thought about it and you've worked it out. One of the great barriers to research protocols getting through ethics committees is that there's just not enough information about how it is that you plan to recruit participants to your study in a way whereby they are not coerced. So think about that. Okay, moving right along, the next section is data collection or generation and analysis. You might wonder why it is that in the heading, this little subheading, we've got both data collection and data generation. So I'll just take a moment to explain the difference between the two. Data collection is when a participant completes a survey form for you. They actually generate something for you that you collect from them. So it's something that the participant in fact does on their own that results in some data for your study. Data generation, on the other hand, is when you as a researcher work with the participant in order to generate data. So an example of that might be an interview where you're sitting asking a participant questions, and it might be an open-ended interview where you've decided to ask what we would call one grand tour question at the start, which might be, tell me about your experience of X. And then from there, you pick up on the leads that the participant provides to you and you ask other questions that explore those leads further. So in that case, you are in fact interacting with the participant in such a way that you are contributing to the data set that is being generated out of that conversation. Data generation also occurs during focus groups, where you work with participants in a small group to elicit information from them, and would generally rely on you interacting with them to actually generate that data. Okay, so getting back to what it is that you need to write in your research proposal under research plan, one of the things that I'd recommend that you consider is the use of diagrams, flowcharts and tables where possible. Because it really is a lot easier for a reviewer or an examiner to actually look at a decent flowchart that explains the different phases that you're planning on undertaking in a study than it is to try and read 2 or 3 paragraphs of dense text. So using visual representations economises on text, but it also shows clarity of thought. And often putting together those flowcharts really makes you think too about the nuts and bolts of how your data collection and analysis processes are going to work. In relation to this section of the research proposal, I'd really advise that you seek peer review before you actually submit it. But don't leave this request for peer review until the last minute. Make sure that you leave a week or two to get some outside feedback on what you're planning in relation to data collection and analysis, so that you can then make some changes that will strengthen your research proposal plan. Also under this research plan subheading, this is where you're going to start to be able to elucidate your sub-questions or objectives. You can use either questions or objectives. It just depends on your study and the design that you're using and how comfortable you feel about framing it up, either using questions or using objectives that are more closely tied to an aim. Both of these provide more concrete detail, or allow you to provide more concrete detail about how you plan to answer the overall research question and achieve the immediate aim of the study. So you need to, again, remembering back to that flowchart from Sandalowski and Barroso, you really need to make sure that you're getting a nice clear link between the immediate aim of the study, that's what they call it, or what I would call the overall aim of the study, and then also the research questions that underlie that. And of course, each one of those sub-questions or objectives would normally tie to a different phase of the research study in relation to data collection and analysis. So choosing these sub-questions or objectives is influenced by your chosen methodology, and in this slide we've got your chosen qualitative methodology, and I suppose that's a fair enough call, because a quantitative design is fairly straightforward in relation to the type of research questions that you would ask, not objectives. Your preference and the preference of your advisors or research team members in relation to whether or not you want to phrase this up as questions or objectives, and also the application guidelines. So again, go back to that printed out set of guidelines that you procured at the beginning of this process and make sure that you comply with what it is that they're asking you to do. Also, you need to think about a few sort of formatting things here, which makes it easier again for people to read your proposal. Consider emphasising the sub-questions or objectives in bold or italics at the beginning of a paragraph that describes the data collection that you're planning on undertaking in order to meet that question. So again, a very clear link between the sub-question or objective and the process of data collection. If you end up with different phases of a study meeting a number of questions or objectives, then consider again using presenting your research plan using a flowchart or a diagram that identifies those phases and stages, and then when you're writing text about it, use the phases and stages as your italicised heading. I'm repeating myself there, don't forget those diagrams or flowcharts. Consider writing up your methods in a sequential manner if that's the way that you think is clearer to the reader. So really at the end of the day, you're trying to make it as clear as possible to the reader about what it is that you're planning on doing. So whether or not you're going to address separate research questions or objectives, whether they bundle up together into phases of a study, then think about that, and then as a consequence write your research plan to match that. This is another opportunity as well, of course, in a qualitative study to demonstrate your understanding of the often iterative process of data generation or collection and analysis. This is particularly the case again for a grounded theory study, where you may go out to where you would go out into the field, you would generate or collect data, you would bring that back, you would analyse that, then you would make some decisions about who you were going to sample next and what type of data you were planning on collecting or generating. So this process goes around and around. So again, a diagram can be very helpful in being able to explain that in a clear and concise way. So relate those methods of analysis after, again, so it's the same, matches up. You've got your data collection, you also need to have your matched data analysis to sub-questions and objectives. And make sure that you describe and justify any techniques that you say that you want to use in relation to analysis. It's not enough just to quickly flip in there that I will use a qualitative software program to analyse my data. You need to be quite specific. What type of software program are you going to use and why? And that's because different software programs do different things. So it's important for the reader to understand exactly how reliant you're planning on being on the software to help you with your analysis. Okay, so next one next point that we need to consider is we want to make sure that you yourself, as the writer of your research proposal, interrogate the quality of your work. And you can do this by considering some of these questions. So at the end of putting up putting together the first draft of your plan for your study, have a little think about some of these points. How have you ensured that the descriptions of participants in the context are accurate and complete? So we're going to make sure that the way that you're planning on collecting the data and analysing it are really going to be able to describe the participants in the context properly. Are your personal biases a threat? Can you see some of that coming out in some of the questions that you've proposed to ask? And how will participant reactions to you and to the procedures used in the study impede the acquisition of valid data? And what are your plans for dealing with that problem? And that comes from an excellent book on research proposal writing that you can find at any university library by Locke and his colleagues. And I would recommend that you go and track one of those down as well in preparing to write any assignments that you have to complete about research proposal writing. So getting back to the point, which is how will participant reactions to you and the procedures impede the acquisition of your data? That's about risk analysis. So are there any risks that you need to identify now to you being able to actually collect data and analyse that? And certainly if you talk to some of the students that have tried to implement research proposals in the past at our university and at other universities as well, you will know that making sure that you get a reasonable sample size is often an issue with some of these small projects. So getting close to the end now, one of the important sections that you need to think about are the outcomes and significance. What do you think is going to happen as an outcome of your study? And do you think that that is important? It's important for you to sit down and think about that now. Are the questions that you're asking in your research proposal going to be worthwhile? Is it actually important for you to go ahead and do this study? Is it important that participants commit time and effort to the study? Is it important that a funding body gives you money for a study if the outcomes themselves are not of significance, if they're not going to make a difference? So you need to really think about that when you're in the early stages of your research proposal. So all of these sections in a proposal are not sort of something that you don't go between. I think you complete all of them and then you reflect on it as a whole, and then you go back and adjust different sections in response to things like this, thinking about the outcomes and significance of your study. Budget and timeline is another important area. There's no point in just putting in ambit claims in a research proposal budget. You need to have detailed and accurate justification for expenditure. So when it comes in particular for things like travel, you need to include approximate quotes, not just ballpark figures. So you need to actually go onto the airline's website and do a little search to see how much it would cost to fly somebody from point A to point B in order to participate in your study, or how much it would cost for you to be the one that's doing the travelling. You need to think about accommodation, you need to think about meals allowances, you need to go and check your institution's research proposal costing requirements. It may well be that you need to include a university overhead in your budget, so make sure that you check for that. The university's research office and any university's research office is very helpful at providing support in and around your budget and costing that up appropriately. Timelines, I've seen some fantastic looking timelines. You can do some neat timelines with just a table in any word processing software. You can also complete or create Gantt charts using specialised software, or even using an Excel spreadsheet and then being able to chart that, and that will create a Gantt chart for you. And again, there are lots of YouTube videos that can help you with this. So I'd advise you, if you feel like putting in a pretty Gantt chart, go and Google on YouTube and you'll find somebody will be able to show you how you need to go about doing that. It is important that timelines, again, are feasible, and they also need to comply with the funding requirements. So again, we go back to that document that says, you have 12 months to spend this research grant. Well, how are you actually going to implement the study within that timeline, and so that you can produce a report at the end. So you need to be able to be very feasible, think feasibility when you're thinking about research activities. And again, this links back to previous sections in the research proposal about designing the methods of data collection and analysis. Okay, so let's just look very briefly at some of the different types of research proposals that you may put together. So first of all, proposals that form part of an application for graduate research. So this would be people who would like to apply to a university to do a master's by research or a PhD or a doctorate more generally. So it might be a doctor of sports and exercise science, or a doctor of dentistry specialising in orthodontics. So proposals for higher degree research are generally shorter in length than would be expected for a funding proposal. So they're somewhere between 6 and 1,500 words. They are best completed in consultation with a prospective advisor or supervisor. And this is a really great opportunity for you to suss out really how it is that you're going to work with that person if you are accepted into a higher degree. If you find that they're not responsive to you, if they're not particularly interested in helping you, if the feedback that they're providing you doesn't really comply with the requirements of the university in relation to length and shape and size, then maybe you need to think about finding somebody else. It's a really good opportunity for both you and your prospective advisor to really sort of have a little try before you buy. Just a word on advisors. Normally when you're thinking about selecting an advisor for a higher degree research study, you would be looking to form a panel of advisors. You as the candidate or the prospective candidate can certainly have input into that process rather than relying on the university allocating you an advisory team. So I would suggest that you think about that, and you think about both your substantive area of inquiry, so your area of expertise that you want to go and do further research on, and also methodological expertise. So they're often quite different things, and often your research panel will be constituted to reflect both of those areas that will impact on your degree. Okay, so the second type of research proposal that we're going to briefly touch on are proposals for ethics boards. So human ethics approval is required for research studies involving human participants, and there are particular formats for ethics proposals that you need to comply with. And again, this is really a matter of making sure that you get the guidelines and you follow the process. You also have to allow plenty of time to obtain ethics approval, and this is particularly the case if your application for ethics approval needs to go through 2 ethics committees, and that is possible if you are deciding to do research outside of the university environment and in an organisation such as a health service or maybe even a school. Competitive grant proposals are the third type of research proposal that we're just going to quickly talk about. Generally, there are very few explicit guidelines for people to develop high quality qualitative research proposals. And so this is about, I suppose, what I was looking for when I went looking for some guidelines. It's not so much specific guidelines for a particular grant scheme, but more guidelines for how to write a great qualitative research proposal that might get you a grant. There's certainly a discussion paper by the National Institutes of Health in the United States that was published in 2001, and it's in the reference list for this PowerPoint, which is well worth going and having a read of. And I think one of the key points that I picked up out of that, and also again in my own experience, is the need to make sure when you're writing your background section to a qualitative research proposal that you're quite focused and you don't end up being too broad. So you need to be focused in order to keep the reader focused. Some of the other hints and tips for writing competitive grant proposals include demonstrating the research team's track record, both individually and collectively. So that's about using members of the research team's publications in your citations list. So that demonstrates expertise in the substantive area or in the methodological area. but also if you've previously published together as a team, making sure that that citation is also in your list of references, because that really demonstrates that you can work together and that you can bring a research study to a fruitful conclusion. So certainly shared research outputs like that support you having a competitive advantage over others who are also applying for a grant. And as I said in this last point and referred to earlier, if you've actually undertaken, some of the chief investigators have undertaken research in the area previously, it's also pretty helpful if you can cite that in the background. So defending your research proposal, and it says here your qualitative research proposal, but this goes for both quantitative and qualitative research proposals. You may well be invited to provide a written rejoinder back to the committee who's making a decision about funding a competitive grant proposal. And so if you are requested to provide a rejoinder, it gives you the opportunity to respond to the reviewer comments, give them some feedback about that. It also allows you to really, if the reviewers have given you really positive feedback, identify that in the rejoinder so that other reviewers can read the rejoinder and go, oh, okay, so yep, what I thought was good, other people thought was good. It certainly, most importantly, provides you an opportunity to give them some counter arguments to criticisms, constructive criticism, of course, and also provide some amendments if there have been errors or changes that you think would strengthen the proposal. When you're writing a rejoinder, make sure that you put it together in a way that's easier for the reviewers to follow. So include things like page numbers where you've made amendments, so that it's quick for the reviewer to be able to go back to your original application and see where changes have been made. Another opportunity that people often have to defend their research proposal is in an oral defence. And normally this would be, I suppose, for graduate students, it's things like your confirmation of candidature at 12 months of candidature. It's also at a pre-completion or sometimes a completion seminar that different universities have for students to present at. The other time that oral defences are occasionally used is when you've shortlisted applicants for a research grant and you think that a useful thing to do would be for them to be able to come and give a presentation on their proposal so that you can get more information before making a final decision. So in summary, when you're writing a research proposal, first of all, make sure you know what the guidelines are. Print them out, have them on your desk, get a highlighter pen, get some sticky notes, make sure that you know what is expected. Ensure that you've got some sort of congruency throughout your proposal. Make sure that there's that link. Remember that diagram. Go back to the diagram that we've got in that was in the earlier presentation. Make sure that you've got a sense of connection between all of the different elements of your research proposal. An example of that is linking your abstract to keywords. Okay, so make sure that there's a nice, neat flow and a good sense of connective strength to your proposal. And make sure that you allow time to seek input from potential advisors, supervisors, and peers. Peer feedback can be really important in strengthening your proposal. And when you finally get around to submitting it, just make sure that you've done a spell check, that it's tidy, that it's clear, that the fonts all match. Again, that it complies to the proposal guidelines. Present something that's well planned, well structured, well written, and then you will be in with a very good chance. So thank you very much for listening to my 2 presentations on the research proposal. I'm always very happy to answer questions, and you can email me at jane.mills@jcu.edu.au. Google me and you'll find me on the web without any trouble. And here is a list of references for you to go and have a look at and maybe do a little further reading. Thanks for your time. Bye.